and hopeful that we can reach an agreement sooner rather than later so that America's economy can continue to recover and American workers can go back to work with certainty. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
May I inquire of the Chair how much time is remaining on both sides?
Gentleman from Massachusetts has 5½ minutes remaining. The gentleman from West Virginia has 9 minutes remaining.
Yes. Could I continue to reserve the balance?
Gentleman from Massachusetts continues to reserve. Gentleman from West Virginia.
He's got 1 minute. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes of my time to Mr. Whitfield from Kentucky.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 2 minutes.
I rise today to support Mr. McKinley's motion to instruct conferees to the Highway Transportation Bill to stop the EPA from regulating coal ash as a hazardous material. Since the formation of EPA has looked periodically at coal ash. Most recently, they did it in 1993 and 2000 under the Clinton administration and came to the conclusion that coal ash does not warrant being regulated as a hazardous waste. The only difference today and then is that this administration is determined to put the coal business out of business. And yet America gets about 48% of its electricity from coal. We cannot expect to meet the demands of this nation's electricity needs over the next 20 years without coal. If EPA is successful in treating coal ash as a hazardous waste, which is quite radical, we know that independent analysis have shown that the cost associated with road and bridge building in America will increase by more than $100 billion over a 20-year period. And in America today, to stimulate our economy, to get our goods to market, we need to improve the infrastructure of this country. And at this time in our nation's history, with the economic problems that we have, to be trying to increase the cost for construction to meet the vital needs of this country is really unconscionable, particularly when there's been no causal relationship found between coal ash and health problems. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California, continue to reserve.
Yes, we continue to reserve.
Gentleman from California, reserve. Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the next 2 minutes of the time remaining to Mr. Kritz from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and thank you to the gentleman for West Virginia for yielding. I rise today in support of the McKinley motion to instruct conferees, asking that the bipartisan-supported coal combustion residuals program language from H.R. 4348 be retained in the final transportation reauthorization bill. Coal ash is of critical importance as it is contained in the composition of the concrete used in our roads, bridges, and other infrastructure. The use of coal ash in transportation has allowed our country to maintain lower costs for infrastructure building. Studies have shown that coal ash costs 20 to 50% less than other products on the market today during a time when our roads are deficient and we need solutions that are cost efficient. Coal ash serves as a reliable resource. We need to invest in materials that will allow us the highest return on investment and stretch our highway dollars for needed improvements. In addition to the cost saving that this will provide, including this language is also critical to support our environment and nearly 300,000 jobs that rely on coal ash use across the nation. In western Pennsylvania, I've witnessed the importance of coal ash to many communities in my district and surrounding areas. We have seen a transformation from orange skies and orange streams to an area whose beauty has been restored thanks to the safe use of coal ash for landfill, transportation use, and other purposes. For these reasons, I strongly urge my colleagues to include in the final conference report the McKinley language so critical to our nation's economic and infrastructure needs. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from California continue to reserve.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
The way I understand the argument on the other side is that if EPA regulates coal ash and calls it hazardous, that stigma will lead construction companies to avoid it as a building material. Is that, if I could address the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, is that an accurate statement that you're fearful of the designation of it and the stigma of that designation as hazardous? Yield to the gentleman.
You say, is there going to be a stigma?
Is your fear that if EPA regulates coal ash and is called hazardous, that designation will be a stigma and will lead to the non-use of coal ash in, by construction companies as a building material?
Mr. Congressman, I believe there is a stigma associated with the that pending decision. Yes.
That is your fear.
There is a stigma associated with the misinformation that's been disseminated. That's correct.
Well, my colleagues, the thing that is so confusing to me is that coal ash is often used as a substitute for Portland cement in concrete. It lowers the cost, it reduces the waste, reduces the greenhouse gas emissions, and we don't need to pass legislation to have that happen. But I want to point out that Portland cement is designated as hazardous. It's a hazardous chemical under the OSHA Hazard Communications Rule. It's a hazardous substance under the Superfund amendments. It's a hazardous substance under Federal Hazardous Substances Act, and it's hazardous material under the Canadian Hazardous Products Act. But Portland cement continues to be used extensively in concrete and transportation projects. EPA, I yield myself an additional minute. EPA
Recognized for an additional 1 minute.
is not seeking to call coal ash hazardous. They want to call it a special waste. But even if they called it hazardous, why would it not be used the way Portland cement is now used, even though that substance is designated as hazardous in all these other statutes?
No, I'm just going to say, sure. My colleague paid attention to the amendment. The amendment is to allow, what we're trying to do is allow more time for the conference committee to work, rather than debate the pros and cons of the environmental aspects of it. We want the committee to continue to work to reach a compromise, and I've been told there's been great progress being made on that. But don't stop at this 11th hour. They're close to making it happen. We want to stand beside them and make sure they finish their work on these negotiations. Where they are,
well, reclaiming
Mr.
my
Waxman,
time.
I'm speaking through the chairman.
Yeah, reclaiming my time, and I yield myself 1 additional minute, which may be the last minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 additional minute.
The reason I ask for more time is, as I understand the McKinley bill, which was adopted by the House, it would prohibit EPA from regulating coal ash because it would be designated possibly as hazardous, and the argument has been that that would be a problem to be used as a substance for concrete and building materials. But I don't believe that to be the case. Now, I think that the committee with the Senate and the House ought to complete its business. But I don't think your amendment is needed under any circumstance. And that's why I would urge members to vote against this instruction, because it is trying to interject in that highway bill something that's really not part of the highway bill and something that on its own should not be adopted in the form of the McKinley bill. And if I have any further time, I reserve it. If not, I'll yield it back. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
Gentleman from West Virginia has 5 1/2 minutes remaining. Okay. Gentleman from California has
Mr.
1
Speaker,
1/2 minutes.
I yield 2 minutes of my time to my fellow engineering colleague from the state of Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection. To order.
I thank the gentleman from Arkansas for that non-objection. I wasn't planning on speaking on this bill, but I was listening in my office to the debate between the proponents and opponents of the bill and felt moved to come over and try to answer some of the questions that the opponents have asked of the bill. EPA is supposed to be a fair referee. They're supposed to, if it's a strike, it's a strike. If it's a ball, it's a ball. If he's out, he's out. If he's safe, he's safe. But the Obama EPA is not a fair referee. It's not a fair umpire. The Obama EPA has a preconceived, what I consider to be radical environmental agenda, and they appear heck bent to impose it on the American people, whether there is a scientific rationale or not. As Mr. Olson of Texas just pointed out, the President as a candidate said that basically he wanted to try to make it impossible to build any more coal-fired power plants in America. When he became President, he appointed a regional administrator down in Texas, Dr. Armendariz, who said that he wanted to try to put hydraulic fracturing out of business and brought a case against Range Resources in Texas that was thrown out on its face because of the lack of evidence that there was any environmental damage caused by hydraulic fracturing in the specific case in Parker County. You had the civil servant at the EPA early in the Obama administration when they were considering their endangerment finding, which they had to impose in order to say they could regulate greenhouse gases. They had a career civil servant who sent a detailed, I think, 50 or 60-page analysis of the proposed endangerment finding and basically said it was hogwash. And he got back emails from within the White House and the higher rankings at the political subdivisions at the EPA that said, don't tell us the facts. We've already made up our mind. This same Dr. Armendariz made a comment not too many years ago that he wanted to crucify industry. Wanted to crucify. He since resigned because of those comments. So those of us that support the McKinney amendment or the McKinney bill do so because we don't think the current EPA is fair. Sometimes we have to tell the EPA what to do because they seem to be incapable of applying basic scientific methods, scientific principle. They want to impose a radical environmental agenda, apparently, and some of us don't think that's right, and we don't think it's good for the American people, the American economy. So I strongly support what my good friend from West Virginia is doing because it at least makes it possible for a source that for years and years and decades has been used without any problem at all to continue to be used. And I think that's a good thing. So I rise in support. I thank the gentleman for the time, and I hope the House will adopt his motion to instruct conferees.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, gentleman from Texas told us he came here, he was so moved to come here to correct the record, and he told us 3 things that are absolutely inaccurate. The President has never said he doesn't want to build new power plants in this country. It is not true. The gentleman from Texas who worked for the EPA never said that this administration or that he personally was against hydraulic fracturing. It's just not true. And the analysis of the endangerment finding by the Bush administration was signed off not by just a career diplomat, career civil servant, but by the head of the EPA appointed by President Bush. So when you get these wrong statements in your head, you can dream up a reason to be paranoid about EPA. EPA wants to protect the public health and safety in regulating coal ash, but in doing so, they will not prevent coal ash from being used for other building purposes. And I would urge that we defeat this motion to instruct, and I yield back whatever seconds I have left.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I request the right to close. And I don't know whether he has any more time left.
The gentleman from California has yielded back his time. Gentleman is recognized for the remaining 2 1/2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, It's fairly obvious that a lot of the folks that have been speaking on the other side of this issue have not read the bill and don't understand what's included in the provision. But perhaps reading the bill, reading the amendment would have given them greater insight as to the role of the EPA, because we are, by virtue of this amendment, we are giving them great insight, great involvement in the this proper disposal of the amount of fly ash that's not recycled. So, Mr. Speaker, it really just comes down to this issue being very clear. Our opponents are just opposed to the coal industry. They're opposed to the men and women working in our coal industry. They're opposed to the 700-plus coal-fired electric utilities. They're opposed to keeping utility costs low. There is a war on coal, Mr. Speaker, and it's time that we stand up for the coal workers, the men working in the coal fields all across the United States, and for the men and women and the consumers that use electricity at low cost. Now, let's go to what the Department of Interior and Transportation have said, that they concur that if fly ash is designated a hazardous waste, as is being considered, fully or in a hybrid classification, it will no longer be used in concrete. That's from the Department of Interior. They've also said that fly ash costs approximately 20 to 50% less than the cost of cement. Department of Interior. Department of Transportation, fly ash is a valuable byproduct used in highway construction. It's a vital component of concrete and a number of other infrastructure uses. Mr. Speaker, I ask all my colleagues to join me today in supporting this motion to instruct the conferees to continue discussing this bipartisan negotiations on this part of the highway bill, and ask their senators to do the same. Let's maximize the use of all the money that we have available to build more roads, rebuild more bridges, do more infrastructure, but most importantly, put America back to work. So I encourage my colleagues to vote for this motion to instruct, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Is time. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider.
Mr. Speaker, I demand the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. What are they looking for? Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on my motion to instruct conferees on H.R. 4348.
Without objection. So ordered.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker,
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan rise?
I would ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks on the legislation and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 4480.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 691 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 4480. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
In the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 4480, which the clerk will report by title.
a bill to provide for the development of a plan to increase oil and gas exploration, development, and production under oil and gas leases of federal lands under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of the Interior, and the Secretary of Defense in response to a drawdown of petroleum reserves from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 2 hours, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce and the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the price of gas and the unemployment rate both remain way too high, and American families are struggling as a result. That's why I support H.R. 4480, the Domestic Energy and Jobs Act, and I would urge my colleagues to do the same. This bill is truly a win-win. The steps that it takes to expand supplies of affordable domestic energy will create many jobs in the process. It's no secret that I don't see eye to eye with President Obama on energy policy, but perhaps the most inexplicable energy policy move the administration has made was the June 2011 decision to withdraw 30 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve with no plan to replace it. And it is hard to understand why the President would take oil from the nation's emergency stockpile while at the same time keeping off limits the far greater amounts beneath federally controlled lands in offshore areas. It's like a couple pawning their wedding rings for cash while ignoring a major gold discovery in their own backyard. The amount of untapped oil in areas kept out of reach by this administration is estimated to exceed the entire Strategic Petroleum Reserve dozens of times over. And these estimates are not mere speculation. Indeed, the recent increases in oil production on state and privately owned lands demonstrate the tremendous energy development potential on federal lands. But that potential will only be realized if the administration's roadblocks are removed. Title I of this bill does that. It requires that the next time the President withdraws oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, he must also commit to more oil leasing on federal lands in offshore areas. The result will be greater supplies of domestic oil and lower prices, not to mention thousands of new energy industry jobs. Gaining access to untapped oil reserves is part of the equation, but before that oil can reach consumers at the pump, it has to be refined into gasoline and diesel fuel. Title II of this bill will help American refiners so that they can keep fueling our economy and fueling the country, because what refiners really need is a little common sense, a little regulatory certainty. It would be an understatement to say that this administration's regulators have not been friendly to domestic oil production, and the truth is they have been no better to the refiners who produce the fuels that we use. In fact, EPA is moving ahead with a number of new regs affecting refineries and other facilities, regs that are likely to drive up the price at the pump and jeopardize refining sector jobs. Title II requires that we learn about the consequences before imposing additional red tape. It sets up an interagency committee that will analyze the cumulative effects of several upcoming EPA regs on fuel prices as well as jobs. It also defers the finalization of 3 measures until after the analysis is completed. The good news is that a future of chronically high gas prices is not inevitable. These policies that I've discussed and numerous other provisions in the legislation will in fact move us toward more secure, more affordable American energy and the jobs that go with it. The nation can increase domestic energy supplies, lower future prices at the pump, and create many more jobs. This legislation takes the steps to usher in the brighter future. I urge my colleagues to join with me in supporting it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 4 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
Throughout this Congress, House Republicans have made an all-out assault on our nation's most basic public health and environmental protections, and they have blocked any effort to address climate change, move towards clean energy or promote energy efficiency. On Monday, Congressman Markey and I released a report that documents this all-out assault. It confirms that this is the most anti-environment House in the history of Congress. Over the last 18 months, the House has voted 247 times to undermine protection of the environment. That's almost 1 out of every 5 votes taken in the House. The oil and gas industry has benefited more than any other sector from these anti-environment votes. Since the beginning of 2011, the House has voted 109 times for policies that would advance the interests of the oil and gas industry at the expense of the environment, public health, and the taxpayer. The result is a grave and growing peril to our environment, to public health, and to our economy. The massive wildfires, floods, droughts, and heat waves that have been afflicting our country are a harbinger of what is to come. Americans know this. As the Washington Post reported this morning, the vast majority of Americans believe our environment is deteriorating, and they know that unchecked pollution from oil refineries and other industrial sources is making the problem worse. Yet what are we doing today? Today's bill is one more massive giveaway, and it is one more assault on the environment. This bill contains 2 proposals reported by the Energy and Commerce Committee. One would block standards for oil companies to clean up their pollution. The other seeks to bypass existing leasing programs in order to pry open every possible acre of federal land for oil drilling. This legislation has been promoted as a solution to high gasoline prices, but this bill is a Trojan horse. This bill would not lower prices by 1 penny. This bill doesn't protect consumers, it hurts them. The bill will keep dirty gasoline on the market, allow oil refineries to spew toxic emissions, and forestall action to address climate change. Tucked inside this legislation is the latter amendment. The language of this amendment cuts the heart out of the Clean Air Act, radically changing the way air quality standards are set. Rather than basing smog standards on what is healthy for our children to breathe, this bill would require standards to be based on what industry says it will cost to reduce pollution. This radical proposal will undermine decades of progress on cleaning up the air. The bill will also cost jobs. The regulations blocked by this bill would create tens of thousands of jobs installing pollution controls and modernizing oil refineries. In addition, this bill would make it harder for the President to tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve during emergencies by layering on new bureaucratic requirements to force drilling across a vast expanse of public land. This bill may be good for the oil companies, it may be good for the special interests, but it is a disaster for the American people. The Republican energy policy isn't an all-of-the-above policy, it's oil above all. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask unanimous consent to put 2 letters in from Chairman McKeon and Chairman Lucas into the record at this point.
Gentleman's request is covered by General Leaf.
Thank you, and I would yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the Energy and Power Subcommittee, Mr. Whitfield.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, I rise today to support the Domestic Energy and Jobs Act for a number of reasons. First of all, it would encourage more production of energy in the United States. 2, it would lower energy cost. 3, it would create additional jobs for the American people. And 4, just as important, it would keep America more competitive in the global marketplace. We live in a global economy, and our ability to have cheap, affordable, and abundant energy is absolutely necessary if we're going to compete with countries around the world. So that's what this legislation is designed to do. All of us have a responsibility to the environment, But we genuinely believe, after hearing after hearing after hearing after hearing, having people who create jobs come in and talk about the additional cost they're incurring because of this overly aggressive EPA headed up by Administrator Lisa Jackson. I would also say that one portion of this bill I think is a very common sense approach. While it would not immediately lower gasoline prices, it does ask the President to establish an interagency task force to examine the impact on jobs, prices, competitiveness of 3 regulations that the EPA has initiated. They haven't finalized it. They haven't decided they're going to finalize it, but they have started the first steps. And so we ask this agency to look, what is the impact on fuel prices with these regulations if they are adopted, and to report back to Congress, and to not finalize any of these rules until at least 6 months after they report back to Congress. It seems to me a common sense approach. We have a responsibility to the American people to have some idea of the impact of these regulations on the economy, and I think my time has expired, so thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I want to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Rush, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent that Mr. Rush be permitted to control the rest of the time for our side of the aisle on the general debate.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of the 112th Congress, we have held over 30 Energy and Power Subcommittee and Joint Subcommittee hearings. We have held over a dozen subcommittee and full committee markups, and including H.R. 4480, which we will vote on today. We have had 10 bills that originated from the Energy and Power Subcommittee that have been voted on by the full House. Yet, Mr. Speaker, from all that time and all that effort, the Energy and Power Subcommittee has produced exactly one substantive bill. Let me repeat, only one substantive significant bill, the Pipeline Safety Reauthorization Act, only one that has actually become law. Mr. Speaker, instead of focusing our efforts on trying to create the clean energy jobs of the 21st century, the majority party has spent the past 18 months lobbying partisan attacks against the EPA and the Clean Air Act in order to appease big oil and some of the more extreme constituencies that the Republican Party represents. Mr. Speaker, most Americans would like to see us utilizing our time working in a bipartisan manner to address critical issues such as access to jobs, clean air and clean water, less dependence on foreign oil, enhanced energy efficiency measures, and an increased reliance on the cleaner and renewable energy sources of the future. Instead, here we are again debating yet another bill that will continue the concentrated effort by the majority party to weaken the authority of the EPA and to delegitimize the agency's regulations as, I quote, job killers, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, with just a little over 20 days remaining before the August recess, we should be focusing our limited time on legislation that will create jobs and move America forward toward a smarter energy future that is less vulnerable to the whims of the world oil market. However, nothing in this bill accomplishes that. The most offensive provision of this bill, the Gas Line Regulations Act, would fundamentally change the cornerstone of public health law, the Clean Air Act, and I ask my colleagues why, to what end. This bill would not create any jobs, but rather would block EPA rules to make the fuel that we put into our cars cleaner. This bill will also block rules that will cut toxic air pollution from refineries. This bill blocks the EPA from requiring new refineries from cutting carbon pollution that causes climate change, and it even blocks the agency from revising the National Air Quality Standard for ozone to reflect the best available science and medical advice about how much ozone is safe to breathe without serious health effects. Mr. Speaker, one truth remains, and that truth is that H.R. 4480 isn't really about jobs, isn't really about lowering gasoline price. It is about an excuse to push a profoundly anti-environmental agenda and provide oil companies with more items from their election year wish list. I oppose this bill because it would strike at the heart of the Clean Air Act and would not provide any tangible benefits to the American people, and I urge all of my colleagues to oppose it as well. I thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, and I would ask that at the conclusion of his 2 minutes that my time be controlled by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, the balance of my time.
Without objection, the request is granted. Gentleman from Kansas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 4480, the Domestic Energy and Jobs Act, the legislation we'll vote on before too long, has 3 very simple missions. The first is to lower and create affordable energy for folks all across America. The second is to create the jobs that go with it. And finally, is to begin to put American energy policy back on a common sense, simple standard that allows affordable energy to be produced here in America by Americans for Americans. You know, we've seen in these discussions, these debates, that there are 2 opposing views on how to do this. The first is the view of folks on the other side who think if we just had one more rule, one more set of regulations, another subsidy, another handout from the taxpayers, we here in Washington, D.C. could find that next great affordable energy source. We've seen how that's worked. We've got gasoline at $3.50 a gallon. We've got utilities all across the country asking for rate increases. There's another view. There's another way to go about it. It's to let the market respond to price signals. It's to get the federal government out of the way, to reduce regulations across the board while making sure we've still got safe drinking water and clean air. Both of these objectives can be accomplished. This legislation simply streamlines and simplifies leasing and permitting processes on federal lands to make sure that consumers have access to affordable American energy. We've got tremendous opportunities right here in America, right in Kansas' 4th Congressional District, in Harper and Kingman, and Stafford and Edwards and Barber and Pratt, all over south central Kansas, an enormous new oil play, creating real affordable energy produced by Americans with American jobs. We also, through this legislation, say if you're going to tap this important American resource, the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, we're going to make sure and replenish it, again, with American affordable energy. This is one of the most consumer-friendly, ratepayer-friendly, taxpayer pieces of energy legislation to reach the House floor in a long time, and I would urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield 4 minutes to my friend and gentlelady from my home state, Ms. Schakowsky.
Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I appreciate his leadership on the Energy Subcommittee. As a member of the full Energy and Commerce Committee, frankly, I'm ashamed that this House is actually considering legislation that puts public health decisions in the hands of the oil industry. Title II of H.R. 4480 eliminates a core principle of the Clean Air Act with respect to smog. For over 40 years, the Environmental Protection Agency has set health-based air quality standards using scientific and medical evidence to identify the maximum safe levels of air pollution for human beings to breathe. Title II would do away with that precedent by requiring that the cost to industry be the primary consideration in determining healthy emission standards. Yes, if this legislation passes, health-based decisions will play second fiddle to dollar considerations for the first time. Over the years, our air has become cleaner and safer because industry has had to comply with more stringent standards. Lead is no longer poisoning our children from the pump. There are fewer kids with asthma due to gas pollutants. And oil companies, rather than suffering, are now making record profits. We don't have to pass the hat for the oil companies. The 5 largest are made $173 billion in profit last year and $33.5 billion in the first quarter of 2012. Our health decisions should be made by health experts, not our worst polluters. H.R. 4480 continues the policy of the 112th Congress. If the oil industry asks, the oil industry gets, no matter the impact on American families. Title II sets up a new interagency bureaucracy to conduct an impossible study of the alleged economic impact of several EPA rules to reduce pollution from refineries and fuels, which haven't even been proposed, using data that doesn't exist. In the meantime, this title blocks the EPA from finalizing several air quality protections that the oil industry would prefer go away. Title II does nothing to protect the consumer from price spikes at the pump or to reduce our country's dependence on oil. Instead, it is a giveaway to the oil industry under the false pretense of lowering gasoline prices. The oil industry doesn't want to reduce the amount of toxic air pollution spewing from its refineries. The oil industry doesn't want to produce cleaner burning gasoline. The oil industry would rather not construct new refineries that are more efficient and less damaging to the world's climate. Oil industry executives would prefer to pocket all their billions in annual profits rather than invest any of it in modern, less polluting technology. I offered an amendment yesterday that would have simply said that the unnecessary and impossible study required under Title II would be paid for by the one industry that most stands to gain from its implementation, big oil. My amendment was not made in order. The American people deserve better than this. They deserve clean air and clean water. They deserve more than a few months of a transportation bill. They deserve a jobs package that will put millions to work, including teachers and construction workers and firefighters and police officers. They deserve affordable student loan rates. Instead, the Republicans of this House have elected to carve out additional privileges for big oil. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Gentleman from Colorado.
I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Kansas, Ms. Jenkins.
Gentlelady from Kansas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, as a member of the House Energy Action Committee and a representative from an energy state, I come to the floor today to support an all-of-the-above energy bill and an all-of-the-above jobs bill. I know firsthand the tremendous economic growth and job creation that comes from unlocking American-made energy. My state of Kansas is undergoing an energy boom. Farmers are making money, tractor dealerships are selling new tractors, and families are paying off loans. Even church contributions have benefited. Sadly, this American success story has been attacked by the current administration's repeated rejection of policies that would increase domestic energy production and create thousands of high-paying American jobs. This important legislation strengthens our energy security, it removes the bureaucratic red tape hindering American energy production, and it creates American jobs. Simply, we cannot afford to delay action that would create thousands of jobs. I urge passage of this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to a fine member of the subcommittee, and a distinguished member of the full committee, Mr. Doyle, 4 minutes. I yield 4 minutes to him.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill before us. Today, we're debating a bill that Republicans tell us will embrace a all-of-the-above energy strategy. The way this bill purports to do this is by opening large swaths of land to oil and gas drilling, halting regulations, and gutting the Clean Air Act. It's clear that this is not a true effort to develop an all-of-the-above strategy, but instead a narrow-minded approach to oil and gas development at any cost. Republicans continue to criticize President Obama and congressional Democrats for opposing efforts to increase U.S. domestic oil production. But the facts disprove this notion. The President hasn't agreed with every proposal to expand oil and gas drilling in the United States and its territorial waters, but he has taken action to open up substantial new public lands and coastal waters to oil and gas development. Today, roughly 75% of U.S. oil reserves on public lands and under our coastal waters have been leased out to oil drillers. In fact, domestic oil production is at an 8-year high, and the production of natural gas plant liquids, liquefied petroleum gases that are used for fuel, is currently at an all-time high of more than 2 million barrels per day. All told, the U.S. Energy Information Agency estimates that U.S. petroleum production in 2012 will average more than 8 million barrels per day. The number of oil rigs in the United States has quadrupled under President Obama. At the same time, petroleum consumption in the United States has dropped by more than 2 million barrels per day since its all-time peak in 2006. Now, since domestic oil production is up and petroleum consumption is down, U.S. oil imports are at a 17-year low. In fact, the United States is importing 10% less oil than it was 8 years ago. Now, one might reasonably conclude that since the United States is producing more oil and consuming less, oil and gas prices would be going down. But that's not happening. Oil and gas prices are going up. Well, how can that be? Oil prices and consequently gas prices are rising because while oil consumption may be lower in the United States, global demand for oil is in fact rising. Rest assured, this bill does nothing to address the real problem of high gas prices, and it does nothing to develop a real all-of-the-above energy strategy for the United States. This bill is going nowhere in the Senate, and it's a true disappointment as this Congress's effort to address high gas prices and an expanded energy portfolio. I urge my colleagues to reject this bill, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman from Colorado for his leadership and for bringing this legislation to put a good energy policy in place in this country, which we do not have today under President Obama. If you look at components of the bill, he talks about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The President has used the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as his bailout fund, basically, for his failed policies. He's rated it, last year he rated 30 million barrels from SPRO, and still to this day hasn't replaced that oil. But on top of that, the President took those dollars, billions of dollars, and spent them on unrelated government spending. So that's what the President's been doing with SPRO, is using it as his personal piggy bank and bailout fund for his failed policies. And, the President and others like to talk about an all-of-the-above strategy. They love to talk about energy production never being higher. One thing they fail to mention is that energy production on federal lands, where the federal government actually has control, is down. In fact, President Obama's own administration, the Energy Information Agency, confirmed again recently that production this year on federal lands is down 30% just in the Gulf of Mexico from last year. So they talk about production being higher. It's higher on private lands where they have no control. And by the way, through EPA and Department of Interior and other federal agencies, they're trying to regulate and shut that down right now, too. So while they're bragging about it, they're trying to shut it down. Just today in New Orleans, they had a lease sale. First lease sale we've had in more than 2 years. And in fact, it shows that there's tremendous interest in exploring for American energy. The only problem is There is no more plan in place. Normally you always have a 5-year plan in this country. By law, the President's supposed to have a 5-year plan. After today, there's nothing on the books for any more future lease sales. And in fact, the proposal that the President has been sitting on shuts off 85% of the areas that were getting ready to be opened up for exploration. And what does that lead to? It leads to a greater dependency on Middle Eastern oil, on these foreign countries that don't like us. The President has shipped tens of thousands of energy jobs out of this country. We've tracked rigs that have left the United States and gone to places like Egypt and Ghana and Brazil. Those jobs ought to be here. We ought to be creating those jobs here and seeking energy independence, and this bill is a great start. I urge its support, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman's courtesy. This bill, sadly, is a missed opportunity. It would have been an opportunity to deal with an all-of-the-above and a jobs bill, but it simply is not. We're in a situation where domestic oil production is strong, and what we are looking at, and currently they're talking about giving out, encouraging more land to be locked up for the future, rather than using the 25 million acres currently authorized for drilling that are not being used by oil companies today. They would allow people to sit on land paying only $1.50, $2 an acre for up to 10 years. Now, I think it's wise for us to be able to move forward to encourage energy production. There would be an opportunity here to deal more aggressively with incenting sustainable energy, clean energy, energy that will be with us for decades to come, rather than depleting existing resources and tying up leases in the future. This is an excuse to undermine existing environmental protections. Why in heaven's name would we seek to undermine tailpipe emission regulations that are already supported by the auto industry? It makes no sense at all. It is not wise to have language that orders the EPA to consider the cost of a clean energy rule rather than the impact on public health, turning on its head long-standing priorities. I suppose you could diagnose lung cancer, but say, well, it's pretty expensive, so let's not say that it's lung cancer. Let's call it a cough. Mr. Speaker, it's important for EPA to make the decisions to protect the public health rather than company profits, which are exploding in time. This is a missed opportunity. I suggest its rejection.
Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to inquire as to how much time my side has remaining.
Gentleman from Colorado has 19½ minutes remaining. The gentleman from Illinois has 12 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I would yield 1½ minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Canseco.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1½ minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman from Colorado for yielding time. High energy prices are having a negative impact on our economy and on our family budgets. But don't take my word for it. This is what my constituents have told me firsthand. There's David from Castroville, Texas, who wrote, quote, "As a self-employed carpenter, gas prices are, for a large truck, cut into my profits. It is madness that the USA is not oil and gas independent. Energy independence is essential for our economy to grow and protect our freedom," close quote. And another constituent, Ray, stated, "I'm a retired engineer and planned to travel with my wife this summer, but had to curtail these plans because of the high cost of gasoline. This has cut deeply into my retirement pay, and I'm spending more time at home because of gasoline prices," close quote. Mr. Chairman, this isn't rhetoric from Washington insiders, but input from working-class Americans who are struggling to make ends meet. I urge my colleagues to support the Domestic Energy and Jobs Act in order to increase energy production, eliminate red tape, and create jobs. I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes To the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for his courtesy. Facts are really kind of difficult if you have to deal with them. The gentleman just spoke about a sad case of an individual that wasn't able to go on a trip because of the high price of gasoline. He may want to tell that individual that the oil industry, on average over the last several months, has exported over 24 million gallons of gasoline a day. 24 million gallons of gasoline a day exported from the United States. Maybe that has something to do with the high prices. But a few other facts. As of March of 2011, onshore, the Department of Interior offered between 2009 and 2011 6 million acres of land for leasing. The oil industry only took 4 million acres. As of that time, March 11, 38 million acres of land were under lease. 25 million acres of land were inactive. A full 65% of the available leased land already in the hands of the oil industry was inactive, not being explored, not being produced. 65% unused, inactive. Offshore, 37 million acres were under lease. 2.4 million acres were active. 70% not being used. So why are we here? Opening more land? There's a reason for it. There is a reason why the oil industry wants to do this. If they are able to acquire a lease, they put it on their books as an asset, thereby giving the appearance that they have a lot of assets available to them, when in fact they have no intention to, in the near term, probably the next decade or so, actually explore and produce. It is a financial game. It is not a game of producing oil. Now, if we really wanted to do something, we would immediately put in place a production tax credit for the wind turbine industry, which is languishing now because we are refusing, Republicans in this case, refusing to put forth a renewal of the production tax so that the wind industry can actually continue to produce energy for our nation. So what does it mean? There are some 75,000 jobs in the wind industry today. Some 17,000 more would immediately go into place if the production tax credit were in this bill and became law. What does it mean? If we were to enact my bill, H.R. 487, those wind turbines would be manufactured in the United States and 1,000 more jobs. Could I request another 30 seconds?
Mr. Guy, another 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
The bottom line of this is simply a play by the oil industry to gather more assets on their balance sheet at the expense of the environment and, just as important, at the expense of a real above-all energy policy. It's a sad day that we're here debating an energy bill that really doesn't do anything at all to help us meet the energy needs of this nation. There's nothing in this about renewables. It's unfortunate. I yield back my remaining time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Latta.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1.5.
Ohio.
I'm sorry. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 4480, the Domestic Energy Jobs Act. This bill comes at a critical time as consumers, farmers, and small businesses are facing high fuel prices, and the President is restricting federal leases from oil production, while at the same time considering releasing oil from the United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I represent an area of the state of Ohio that has the largest number of agriculture producers, manufacturing jobs, and small businesses in the state. And when you look at these numbers, we'd have a very high disproportionate hit for my constituents because of high oil prices. As this bill requires all regulations to be subject to a thorough analysis of costs, benefits, and potential hurdles to implementation. The Gasoline Regulations Act of 2012, which is part of this bill, will delay regulations that could significantly increase fuel prices on consumers, farmers, and small businesses while these regulations are under review. It will also provide some much-needed regulatory relief to refiners who are struggling to stay in business due to the high cost of fuel. Reducing the cost of refining fuel is a great first step, but the key to reducing fuel prices is to bring more supply onto the market. The only time that oil should be released from the Strategic Petroleum Reserves is to counter severe supply interruption. I support legislation that will allow increased access to responsible domestic oil production, and for these reasons I support the bill and I yield back. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And at this time, I would like to recognize the Majority Whip